Thank you for joining me today as I give a brief overview of the Dead Sea Scrolls for those people who are interested in looking into these texts. By no means is this an exhaustive study, just an introduction. So in 1947, there were fragments found. About 1/6 were in Aramaic. The majority were in Hebrew, including Paleo-Hebrew. A very small minority was written in Greek, a couple in Latin, and a few scrolls in cryptic script. 22% were found from our regular canon that we know today. 40% are what's called non-canonical scrolls that were found about the calendar. So in regards to the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar, otherwise known as the Zadok calendar, the Jubilees calendar, and the Enoch calendar, 40% of what was found has something to do with the calendar. That is amazing. Not all of these scrolls have been found. These are hidden in caves, and this is only what we know of. We haven't even seen all of the releases of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so not all of it has been released. Not all of it can be deciphered because they're in fragments, like the photo that you see on the right-hand side. So not all of it will be released to the public either. Some of it has actually been auctioned and owned by private parties we might not ever see. All right, so today I want to go into a couple of translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some versions that you can purchase for yourself. There are various texts out there, but I'm going to go over one that I really like, and it's pictured over there on the right. It's the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation. And this is by Michael Weiss, Martin Abegg, and Cook, Edward Cook. All right, so the translators of this particular one have a grasp on the difference between the Essenes and the Zadokites, and that's going to come up throughout my presentation. But this is why I like them. They do not ascribe to the community that kept the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Essenes. They realize that the group is not mentioned in any of the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Zadokites, the sons of Zadok, are referenced throughout those texts. The authors understand that the community members who kept the scrolls valued the solar calendar. They share when alternative texts are embedded or added to the documents, which some authors do not differentiate. They realize that the authorships are not from the same community as Qumran community, but ascribe to different doctrines. So what they're saying is there are scripts, fragments that they have found that might have one handwriting, and then there's something written above the line or below the line or over on the side that is a different handwriting. So they can tell that there is somebody adding to the text. All right. They also understand that the Pharisaical rabbinical groups are in opposition to the Qumran community on many doctrinal beliefs. They understand there were multiple calendars used during this time and that there were calendar wars. These documents do not ascribe to a lunar calendar keeping in any form at all. I do differ slightly on some of their connections of people, time frames, and interpretations overall. Their understanding of the text are very logical and match historical definitions and analysis. The complete Dead Sea Scrolls by Giza Vermes is okay. I will use it on occasion to confirm some information, but don't personally like his commentary. He is also a proponent of the Essene-Qumran hypothesis. More on that in just a moment. All right, strength in numbers. What was found there? So we actually have a document called the Damascus document, and it was found in Geniza, Egypt, and also in Qumran. There were 2 documents found in Geniza and 7 in Qumran. The reason why I call this strength in numbers is because the more copies that we find, the more important I believe it was for the group, right? These numbers here indicate where these articles were found. So 4Q would mean it was in the 4th cave at Qumran. 266 and 272 is the fragments that are being found, or the articles. All right, next is the community rule. And this one has 13 copies, which is an amazing amount. Nearly as many copies as Genesis and Exodus that were found, and more than almost any other books of the Bible that have been found in Qumran. Pretty amazing. Again, the more the copies, the more I think it was important to this group. Jubilees, 15 copies found. All of them were written in Hebrew and one on papyrus. The Book of Enoch, we have just the Book of Enoch, 7 manuscripts found. 20% of them were in Aramaic. The Book of Heavenly Luminaries, 4 were found. Then we have the Book of Giants, 9. And then we also have the Astronomical Enoch. All right, and the other one I want to mention is the Temple Scroll. 12 were found. And the name of Moses in this scroll has been omitted, but it is completely assumed to have been written by him because he speaks in the first person. All right, and we're going to get into that in a little bit, but I do believe that these documents are indeed scripture, in my personal opinion. All right, Qumran and the caves. Let's take a look at the site. So we have here on the picture on the left, we have the locations of where the scrolls have been found. And then we have Qumran over here to the right of the caves. And so it is believed that those who hid the documents lived in this nearby community of Qumran. So this was the ruins here of Qumran next to the Dead Sea. This is a picture of the caves in which some of these documents have been found. So today we'll be focusing a lot on the community of Qumran. It is believed that people did not, in fact, live in the caves necessarily. They just used that location to hide the documents. The people in Qumran, who were they? We are going to be talking about Yashar Hirschfeld and the Keepers of the Scrolls. He is an author who wrote Qumran in context. Yashar Hirschfeld is a professor of classical archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Institute of Archaeology, and he was the director of several major excavations in the Qumran area. And I personally own this book, Qumran in Context, and if you like archaeological finds and to look at artifacts of our ancestors, I highly recommend it. He explains that the experience that he gained working on Greco-Roman period rural settlements gave him the background to write his controversial book, Qumran in Context, in 2004, in which he concluded on morphological grounds that Qumran was a Judean manor house and thus not the home of Essenes. Now, Yashar says that the owner of Qumran not only was affluent, but also had social and economic ties with the centers of administration within and beyond Judea. So he believes that the site at Qumran looks more like a manor house, and he's calling it a Judean manor house because he believes that it has ties to Judea. And he thinks that it was mostly owned by a singular owner who had perhaps servants or members of his household. I partially disagree on this because after reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can ascertain something very important. There was a hierarchy in Qumran. There was a leader. He was affluent because he had priestly influence in the area. He was the overseer. Under him were the Zadok priests. Under that, this hierarchy, the Levites, and then the proselytes or the Gentile converts. So there was a hierarchy. While I don't believe it was one person who owned and maintained the property with slaves and workers, employees, I do believe that the overseer was head of the location. Hirschfeld also excavated a site south of Qumran, and that place is called En-Gedi or En-Gedi, and we see Qumran and En-Feshka up here, and then we have En-Gedi or En-Gedi 25 miles south of the area. When he excavated and when they looked at the location, it looked completely different than what the habitations at Qumran looked like. He noticed that there were 28 cell habitations here. All right, and so from 1996 to 2002, Hirschfeld directed excavations at a site on a terrace overlooking En-Gedi, which consisted of a series of small dwellings. His analysis led him to conclude that all features of the site, its location above En-Gedi, simplicity, and unique nature conform to Pliny the Elder's famous passage on the Essenes. His proposal on the site has found little acceptance among archaeologists, and that is mostly because they have it in their brain that the group living in Qumran were the Essenes because of Pliny and Josephus's comments. Everyone else, they're just going to follow along. The archaeological picture that emerges from the excavations at Qumran and Ein Feshka does not accord with the historical descriptions of the Essenes and other Jewish ascetics living in the region. All right, so we're going to look at the archaeological proof that Essenes were not at Qumran. And we get the descriptions of the Essenes from Pliny the Elder, Philo, and Josephus. But I think, along with many other people, that this was a misidentification of those who lived in the Qumran caves. So the first couple of descriptions that Pliny the Elder gives is that these men did not marry. They were celibate monks, and they lived in En-Gedi, near some palm trees, and that they were poor. They were poor men who just gave up money to live there in seclusion. Now, the archaeological findings in En-Gedi, which is 25 miles south of Qumran, they did not find animal bones. They believe that they were vegetarians. Again, as I showed you in the picture, there were 28 single-room cells found, indicating that they lived in seclusion. There was basic architecture found, no signs of wealth. There were small basic pottery finds. They looked like they lived with meager means, and there were only 4 coins found when excavating the area. There were signs, though, of gardening. All right, so here we're going to have a completely different look when we see Qumran and the findings there. Now, while some men did choose to live celibate lives, we see many times in the Dead Sea Scrolls that these men often did have families. And then we do believe that the Zadok priesthood was from Judah. These are the prominent people. And so there was a little bit of wealth, all right? And what's interesting to note is the Damascus document was actually originally called the Zadokite fragments. I wonder why. All right, the findings that were in Qumran, there were over 1,200 tombs that included many women and children in Qumran. They were even buried with some jewelry. They found stone and glass vessels, fine pottery ware, cosmetic utensils, an abundance of coins, and spindle whorls. So they had jobs there. They created things. And this is actually in Yashar's Hirschfeld's book. And so he has a lot of great pictures of the finds that they made in Qumran. There were many animal bones and ashes. There were large meeting rooms. There were ornate decorations, including Hasmonean Roman period architecture and inkwells, similar to those that were found in upper-class homes and places of business. All right, now we are going to talk about another gentleman, Norman Golb. So Norman Golb was an expert of the Cairo-Geniza Library of Documents, which were found in the 19th century, and he's been arguing for years that the scrolls were the work of many diverse groups. He also argued that the Qumran complex was not an Essene monastery, but a fortress for Jews fleeing Roman invaders. In 1996, he wrote a book called Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? And he has had a lot of backlash from the mainstream scholars who are trying to silence him because he believes that there is a difference between those who lived in Qumran and kept the scrolls and the Essenes. Now, another person, which I've mentioned on several of my videos, is Rachel Elior. And she says, scholars who have questioned the existence of the Essenes have been severely criticized since the 1950s and continue to be spurned today. And she's talking about Golb in this instance. Yashar Hirschfeld, he also states in regards to Golb that other scholars have called for a complete severance of any connection between Qumran and the Essenes. All right. My last paragraph goes in to talk about the fact that they called them Essenes when they had only found 7 texts. Now, however, there are fragments from approximately 800 scrolls, and the response was to claim that the Essenism had been a much more comprehensive movement than had been supported until just after the discovery of the first cave. This was perhaps a legitimate approach in the sense of being theoretically possible, but one also threatening to broaden the sense of the Essenism until this group was defined out of existence. No scholar of the time even concerned himself with offering a cognate explanation for the wide variety of phylactery versions found in the caves. And we have more arguments with the Dead Sea Scrolls continued. There's another gentleman I want to introduce, and his name is Herschel Shanks, and I'm going to read this quote. Those who challenge the Essene identification argue that the so-called sectarian sects often seem inconsistent with the Essene doctrine as reflected in independent sources and are even inconsistent among themselves. For example, how do militant, even warlike statements in some of the Qumran texts square with the commonly held view that the Essenes were pacifist? So what Herschel is saying is based on our information from Pliny and Josephus that these were celibate monks who were pacifist. Yet if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're going to read about people who are willing to take up arms and fight for their beliefs. Right? Another quote says the identification of the Essenes with the Qumran sect was often supported with a circular argument. If the dominant hypothesis for some 40 years yielded the monks, monastery, bishop, celibacy, and numerous other terminological exaggerations used to describe the Qumran text, behind which lay a distinct set of preconceptions, for the most part, the fallacy of these arguments somehow escaped scholarly scrutiny. All right, so again, those are words and terms that have been thrown out there about this group of people, yet if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're going to get a whole different kind of people. All right, lastly, let's see here. Most Dead Sea Scrolls scholars agree that Qumran, the settlement near the caves where the scrolls were found, was inhabited by Essenes, an anti-temple Jewish sect in the years before the Roman destruction of 70 CE. A stalwart minority of scholars maintains, though, that the evidence is insufficient, that in fact Qumran was not an Essene settlement. Among them is Israeli archaeologist Yashar Hirschfeld. Again, we've heard him before. Most scholars agree that the word Essene does not appear in the scrolls, nor does any inscription from the site say that it was an Essene settlement. So again, the name or the word Essene is nowhere mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now we're going to get back to Rachel Elior, and this is from the Jerusalem Report. It says, moreover, she asked, how is it possible to identify the Essenes, who have apparently nothing to do with the priestly laws or priestly heritage, with the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are replete with references to priestly life, ritual, and calendar? When the renegade sons of Zadok, who were deeply conservative, left Judaism, they took with them their library, which was all about their priestly heritage. She theorizes that they took the library to isolated Qumran for safekeeping because Jewish life was unstable in Jerusalem. Elior notes that there was or has always been a secondary debate among scholars whether the scrolls were actually written in Qumran or just brought there for storage. So here's another inconsistency with all of this information. And she also goes on to say, it is absurd to think that for so many years, such a large group of people numbering in the thousands led a celibate life, which is against the Jewish imperative to go forth and multiply, and are hardly ever mentioned. And Yashar Hirschfeld also agrees with Elior, and he says the word Essenes is not mentioned in any of the scrolls. So again, you can see the commonality of all of these experts trying to figure out why this narrative is still going on about the Essenes. So you must see this common theme now, right? So if you speak against the norm, you are silenced and ridiculed, especially in the academic or archaeological fields. All right, there is another connection between Qumran and Jerusalem. A gentleman by the name of Jim Barfield. I recently saw a clip and had to share that, and it is him stating that when he was looking at the ruins of Qumran, he thought, that looks really familiar. And he transposed the finds of the archaeological site onto a map of what Jerusalem looked like. And he said, wow, this is almost identical. So you can see the one on the left is in fact Qumran, and the one on the right is Jerusalem. Very, very similar in how the layout of the whole community was. Now, it looks like Jim Barfield is also in agreement with the Essene Qumran theory. But my question is, why or how would 28 poor monks who are anti-Jerusalem create a community based on the shape and the layout of Jerusalem? Think about that. All right, we're moving right along here. We're going to be introducing some more information about Qumran, but this time we're going to be adding a very well-known person, John the Baptist, who we know came out from the wilderness. John 1:28, it says, these things were done in Bethabara, beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. And I bring this up because Bethabara, you can see that little house right there. Let me see if I can show you. Right here is Bethabara. Bethabara is right up in this area, just north of Qumran. And this area that I have circled is the location called the Jordan Valley. And John was baptizing in the Jordan. Now, scriptures, some places say Jordan River, some places just say the Jordan. Well, this is the Jordan Valley. Many people believe, I included, believe that John, when he came out to baptize, he was coming out from the areas of Qumran, Bethabara. John the Baptist, I believe, came from the Qumran group. Dr. Eli Lazorkin Einzenberg, the head of the school at Israel Institute of Biblical Studies, states, one notable similarity in the difference between the Qumran materials and the Gospels is this. Qumran presents its community stationed in the wilderness, about 20 kilometers from Jerusalem, as the voice calling out in the wilderness, while the Gospels speak of the fulfillment of Isaiah 40, verse 3, only in terms of the ministry of John the Baptist. Isaiah 40, verse 3 says, "A voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our Elohim." It's amazing because in the community rule, this is a document based on the rules of those living in Qumran. And it says, when such men as these come to be in Israel, conforming to these doctrines, they shall separate from the session of perverse men to go to the wilderness, there to prepare the way of truth, as it is written, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. This means the expounding of the law, decreed by God through Moses for obedience, that being defined by what has been revealed for the age, for each age, and by what the prophets have revealed by his Holy Spirit. Sounds like John the Baptist has been taught the community rules. If you haven't read the book of the Nazarene, I highly encourage it. There is a section in there called the Book of Yochanan, the Enlightened of Elohim, or the Book of John, based on the book of John the Baptist. So it states that Elizabeth takes John and runs to seek shelter for those who seek to kill the infants. They go through Sheba into the wilderness towards Qumran. And the quote says, when Yochanan had grown into manhood, he reappeared in the wilderness of Bethema, which otherwise is Bethabara. And some people who lived apart from others were directed to him, and he was raised in their ways. I wonder what group of people lived in the wilderness near Qumran or Bethabara. It says he remained with them until the day he went forth to herald the coming of the deliverer. For he was of the Zophim who watched for the coming of the kingdom. He said, I am not the one you anticipate, whose coming is at hand. Is it not written, I will send a forerunner to prepare the way? I am that herald. So the word Zophim is Strong's 6822, which means watchman or to keep watch. Those in Qumran were absolutely of the Zophim. There is constant talk in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the Redeemer, Messiah, and his coming kingdom. All right, more on John. And this is from James Charlesworth. I'm going to read this out here. Not long after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, scholars noted the similarities between certain Qumran texts, such as the rule of the community, and the descriptions of John the Baptizer in the New Testament. Some have argued that John the Baptizer belonged to the Qumran community, based on the observations that he followed an aesthetic program similar to theirs in the same time period and geographical area near the Dead Sea. We are told in Mark 1:6 that John ate only wild honey and locusts and wore a garment of camel's hair. We know that these were foods allowed by the Jewish laws enforced at Qumran. Moreover, they make note the most sense if we assume that John had made the Qumran vow not to receive food or clothing from outside the group, Rule of Community 5:16. John the Baptizer and the Qumran community also both used apocalyptic language, images and ideas about the end of the present age and in the context of divine judgment. Early in the life of the Qumran community, many of its members had been priests associated with the Jerusalem temple, and John the Baptizer's father was a temple priest. Luke 1:5-23. He goes on to state, both John and the Qumran community emphasized and used prophetic imagery, especially from the book of Isaiah, Indeed, both interpreted Isaiah 40 verse 3 in the same way. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. For both wilderness was the place of spiritual preparation. John and the Qumranites both emphasized the need for purification by ritual cleansing in living water, and they associated this act with the eschatological salvation. Lastly, both John and the Qumranites call unfaithful Jewish groups, for example, the Pharisees, a brood of offspring of vipers. They also share a strict dualist worldview. However, there are also important differences that make it difficult to assume that John the Baptizer was a full member of the Qumran community. John's message called Israel to repent and had a missionary quality to it, whereas the Qumran community was mostly focused inward on those predestined to be the sons of light. The Qumran group separated themselves from others to form a community they felt was the genuine Israel. All right, now we have the Qumran community, which is the very same group Saul went after. Acts 9, 1 through 3. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. So he's talking about going after people belonging to the way. Now, if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, they call themselves the people of the way. And it also mentions that there are men and women. So if he was in fact going to a group of Essenes, so-called monks, I don't think he would find women at that location. So a couple of hints right there that he was going towards Qumran. All right, F.A. Schilling has suggested that the early Christians fled from Jerusalem to Damascus because they were in sympathy with the Zadokite sect there. The identification of this sect with the Qumran Covenanters has been increasingly accepted as more evidence comes to light from the Dead Sea area. All right. So again, we have more people coming out to say, you know, we might need to rethink this whole Essene thing. All right. Now we have Acts 22, 12 through 16. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me, said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear the voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash your sins, calling on his name. Well, Ananias is referring to the righteous one, or the teacher of righteousness. This is a term that's used in the Dead Sea Scrolls many, many times. Ananias is a devout man. He's living in Damascus. I believe that he was also a man who learned under the group in Qumran. He's using all of the same wording that we hear over and over in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we believe that Paul did visit Qumran on his way to Damascus. There is a statement in Paul's letter to the Corinthians which tells us that he made a dramatic escape from the governor under Aretas, the king of Damascus, in 2 Corinthians 11:32. It says, In Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desirous to apprehend me. In the Canadian Journal, it states that we may conclude from this bit of evidence that the Damascus at this time was under the authority of Aretas, the king of the Nabateans. It is worthy to note that in the Arabic version of the polyglots, this passage of Galatians 1:17 is rendered, Immediately I went to El-Becca. So J.B. Lightfoot locates this place as east and northeast of the Dead Sea. If he is correct, Paul was very close to Qumran Indeed, we could render the verse to say, I went away into Arabia, and also during that time to Qumran, and again I returned to Damascus. So Galatians 1:17 through 18 leaves us to contemplate if he indeed was taught under the community in Qumran. It states, Neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia, and returned again to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and abode with him 15 days. Something very interesting is that the community rule states this. When these men have been grounded in the instructions of the Yahad for 2 years, provided they be blameless in their conduct, they shall be set apart as holy in the midst of the men of the Yahad. So we might conclude that Paul spent 2 years in the community under the Yahad. All right, many of you want to switch gears and just find out what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's take a look. What is in the Zadokite library? What was found there? Let's take a look. In the library, we find things such as the Apocrypha. We found the Book of Tobit, letters to Jeremiah, Sirach. They also found Jubilees, Baruch, additional Psalms written by David himself, the Book of Enoch, and we find things like the Qumran or Zadokite rules, such as the community rule we've mentioned previous in the Damascus document, as well as a document called the Temple Scroll. We find prayers and thanksgivings and so much more. I can't even list it. There's very many finds, and they're wonderful finds. So let's take a look at some more information. We're going to be talking about the authenticity of these books that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of those is the Book of Jubilees. It has a whole lot more weight to it when it's mentioned throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of those places is the Damascus document. In the Geniza document, column 16, it states, But the specification of the times during which all Israel is blind to all these rules is laid out in detail in the Book of Time Divisions by Jubilees and Weeks. So this is specifically mentioning the Book of Jubilees. We have the Book of Enoch, the first book of Enoch, by the way. It is mentioned in several documents, some of which are the words of Levi, the Testament of Dan, the Testament of Benjamin. In 4Q 559, called a Biblical Chronology, it states, He gave to Levi the book of the words of Enoch to preserve and pass on to his own descendants. And then in 1Q of the Geniza, it's called the Tales of the Patriarchs, says, They asked me, in referring to Abram, for knowledge of goodness, wisdom, and righteousness. So I read to them the book of the words of Enoch. Amazingly, both of these books were also found in the Ethiopic Bibles. So much more weight, right? So much more weight for them. I do believe personally they are scripture, but that's my personal opinion. Moving right along. More on the authenticity of these books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know your first thought is the Book of Jasher has not been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Tina. I know. It hasn't been found yet. If you put the Book of Jasher up to the Tales of the Patriarchs, the Apocryphal Joshua, Jubilees, and the Vision of Amram, if you put them side by side, they're going to look quite similar. There is 4Q225. It's called the Paraphrase of Genesis and Exodus. That also aligns with Jasher. Some things that I've found in all of those books when I've done my studies is they match Jasher better than Jubilees, Genesis, or Exodus. So I really find that the Book of Jasher perhaps has been found. There are rewritings of Genesis and Exodus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what the paraphrase of Genesis and Exodus is. They're reworkings, rewritings. They're very similar text, right? Just reworded differently than what we see in our Masoretic today. Well, I believe the same thing is with the Book of Jasher. You can put all of those side by side, the book of Jasher, and you're going to see a lot of commonalities. All right, my next example, similar to the book of Jasher. If you put those side by side, you're going to see a lot of similarities. My other example is a book called The Order of the Ancients. Now, I had read a book called The Order of the Ancients a while back, and I had put it aside. And recently, when rereading the community rule, I thought to myself, well, you know, this actually sounds a lot like a book that I've read called The Order of the Ancients. The publisher of The Order of the Ancients stated that he had found a document and he couldn't find the author, he couldn't find any information, it was unknown to him, but he thought to print it up and call it The Order of the Ancients. I actually had to contact him recently and tell him, do you realize that the book that you published is actually the community rule? And I'm pretty sure he didn't take my word for it. So he asked me for proof. And I went paragraph by paragraph. And I showed him just a little bit different text. It's written a little bit differently, but they were in fact the same text. So that's the example that I have for Jasher as well. I believe that those are all paraphrases. They're all written out, maybe slightly different than the book of Jasher, but in some cases, they're actually the same document, in my opinion. All right, who are the participants? Who are the people or people groups mentioned in the scrolls? We have participants both positive and negative. So some of the people mentioned in a positive light are the teacher of righteousness, which I believe is Yahusha, the sons of light, the proper way, people who go the proper way or the way, the beloved teacher, I believe is Moses, the Yahad, the overseer or the leader of the way, the sons of Zadok or the priests, the Levites, the proselytes or the Gentile converts. Those are all the people in the positive light. Those who are mentioned in the negative light is the man of lie, the wicked priest, sons of darkness, prince of lights with Belial, the boundary shifters, the shoddy wall builders, the angel of obstruction, and Mastema or Satan or Azazel. Next on the list, can't forget to mention the Zadok calendar. So everyone wonders where the Zadok calendar came from. This is where we find it. This is the calendar that the Zadokites promoted. All right, many people want to know where we can find information on the 364-day calendar. As I mentioned at the beginning, 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls has something to do with the calendar. Amazing. Again, power in numbers. If 40% of this found had to do with the calendar, I think maybe we should take a look at that. Anyway, this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a list that I made for myself as I was studying them. So anytime Sabbaths and feast days are spoken about, when or how to celebrate them, I wrote them down. So those are mentioned in Sabbaths and festivals, the songs of Sabbath sacrifices, liturgy, temple scroll, festival prayers, annotated law of Moses. The book of Jubilees was mentioned in the apocryphal Joshua, the Damascus document, and vision of Daniel. The priestly services are mentioned in priestly service, Sabbath entrance, fragmentary historical writings, priestly service year 1-4, priestly rotation on the Sabbath, priestly service as the seasons change. Other mentions of the calendar are in the Sectarian Manifesto, Apocalyptic Psalms of David, Astronomical Enoch, Jubilees, Commentary on Genesis, Calendar of the Heavenly Signs, and Synchronistic Calendars. Mentions of the moon are in the document called The Phases of the Moon and 4Q318. Anywhere mentioning the evening to evening, as when a day is mentioned in Songs of Sabbath Sacrifices, Daily Prayers, Damascus document, and Purification for Feast Days. You've probably seen this picture over on your right before because I have presented this before. I got this from the fragment that I have here on the left, 4Q209. It is a fragment that is describing the moon leaving Virgo and entering into Libra. And it states, "Then it exits from the fourth gate and rules over the rest of the day at 3 1/2 seventh strength. And the moon's light shines on the seventh night of this month at 3 1/2 seventh strength. Then it enters the third gate and is dark the rest of the night at 3 1/2 sevenths darkness." So this is describing an almost quarter moon going from Virgo into Libra. That's what I have pictured here on the right. You've probably already seen this. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q318, and this is my chart of how the moons move through the zodiacs. And it is given to us in full description in this scroll. And so this is the chart that I made based on what this scroll is telling us. So for example, 4Q318, column 7 describes a few things, but I'm pointing out the part that is describing the 11th month. It states, "And on the 13th and on the 14th, the crab." So we know that is the Cancer zodiac. On the 15th and on the 16th, the lion, which we know as Leo. On the 17th and on the 18th, the Virgin, which would be Virgo. So this is literally telling us where the moon is, each part of the phase of the moon's cycle. Another thing found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the priestly order. Now if you look over here on the left, year 1 is Gamul, 2 is Jedediah, 3 is Minjamin, 4 is Shekinah, 5 is Jeshabeab, and 6 is Hapizes. Now I didn't pronounce them right. I'm doing my best. Anyway, the 4Q319 calendar of the heavenly signs, fragment 1 in column 4, describes to us the end of the second Jubilee into the third Jubilee and who is in the order for the priests. So I have here, let me get my little handy dandy pinpointer. It says the conjunction of Shekinah in the 3rd year and the conjunction of Gamul in the 6th year. So I'm going to go over here. This is, if you haven't watched it, I have a Jubilees timeline video, and this is the chart that I created that shows the years through the Jubilees and how I saw that it was explained in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here we're talking about the end of the second Jubilee and a time where Shekinah is in the 3rd year. And that will be here in the year 94 from Adam. That is the 3rd year of Shekinah. And then it says, then Gamul is in the 6th year. So we have the 1st year, 2nd year, 3rd year is Shekinah, 4, 5, 6th is Gamul. All of these blue highlights are the years for Gamul. All right, so this is actually showing you that this is correct based on 4Q319. Then it says the conjunction of Shekinah in the 2nd year. So now we're going to go in the next year. So now we're into the 3rd Jubilee, the 2nd year. This is where Shekinah would be. And then we have Gamul in the 5th year. So we have 2nd year, 3rd, 4th, 5th year. This lines up. So this is how I can determine that I in fact have the correct dates for Gamul and Shekinah. All right, so this little screenshot down below is where I believe we are now. Right here we are in 2025 as I talk today. This is a Gamul year. Now there are people who are telling us that it is a Jubilee year. I will state that based on what I have here, we are not in a Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is not the same as a Gamul year. Gamul is every 7th year. This row is the Jubilee years. If you can see, Gamul is not always on a Jubilee year. So our next Jubilee year, according to my reckoning, will be the year 2028. That's for a whole other day, but I just wanted to show you, based on the calendar of the heavenly signs, we can in fact find the priestly order and match it up based on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So with all of this information, you probably want to know, why was this hidden? And we all want to know the same thing, but we believe that the Father is going to reveal to us things in His appropriate timing. Why most of this is not in our canon, even though they found it in the 1940s and 50s, even though some of it has been transcribed for years, why do we not have this in our canon? Why has it not been added? Well, I'm going to refer back to Rachel Elior, and this is what she says. They, Jewish rabbis, not only discarded the apocryphal texts, but, according to Elior, probably amended some passages in the books they would include in the Bible to minimize references to the solar calendar, to the angels, and to the story of Enoch. By doing so, the sages prepared the Jewish people for the long haul through the ages. The conduit to the divine was no longer a monumental building in Jerusalem served by a priestly caste. As they went into exile, the Jews took with them the Sabbath and the Bible, but were no longer dependent on a specific holy place or on priestly intermediaries. This is what she said in Jerusalem Post 2009. What was hidden in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, this is my list that I have put together. It mentions many times the coming of the Messiah and his priesthood, mentions the last days, it mentions extra books and hidden documents. It mentions laws that are briefly touched on in the canon but expounded in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It mentions the Gentiles can be converted into the fold. It mentions, just like Elior stated, the priestly cycle and calendar as opposed to what is being taught in Israel today. There are additional festival days of observance, such as new wine, new oil, and wood. Again, it's one of those things that's briefly mentioned in the canon, specifically Nehemiah 10, but we learn more about it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It absolutely confirms Enoch and Jubilees for the calendar, and confirms evening to evening for a day. And there's a big clue about the day of his return. I'm not going to get into it on this presentation, but stay tuned. Other things that I have noted along my studies, the mention of the sons of Zadok returning in the last days. Very interesting. We find that the last days will be longer than expected. I found out why the verse in Matthew 1:25 says, "But he knew her not until she had given birth to a son," in regards to Mary and Joseph. I found confirmation that evening is the start of the day, and that the Day of Atonement has a bigger meaning for the last day. I also found an angel of obstruction goes away when you begin to follow the law of Moses. I found out why David was allowed to take more than one wife and not be punished. I found there were extra laws and books that were to be kept secret in the ark. And it also confirms 7 heavens, the firmament, and the pillars. Join me in studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. We will begin by studying the Damascus document, which is the first one in the book, the new translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls book. So we're going to begin there. So if you don't already have your book, I'll give you a little bit of time. Read it, take notes, and be ready to share. I hope to be posting more on this subject, and perhaps we can get together and share what we've learned. Be blessed, everyone.